All right. Thank you all for joining us. We got started last week. We introduced the book of Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, what exactly the intention of the book seems to be, what it seems to be at first glance, which we said is, if you read the book just as is, oh, here, let me post the website again. I'm sorry. Okay. If you read the book just as it is, it seems to be a pretty depressing book. But in reality, my argument is that it's actually an empowering book. It's something that tells us that there's something more to life than just living or just surviving, let's say. There's something more to what we're doing here. And he goes through a very long process of getting there, but he's going to be proving to us that we should stop to think, we should enjoy what we're doing here, but we should really focus our energies in the right places. And that's how we're going to get the most out of our lives. So we discussed last week the opening verse, and you know what? We're going to jump right into the screen share so that we could just see the text as is. If you give me 1 second, I had set up before. Okay. All right, we're going to jump into the screen share. And here we go. Okay. So now this is, again, the text. And I mentioned last week, the reason why I am not sharing the English translation is because I typically don't love the way English translations work because they're very generalized. There's multiple ways of approaching the books of Tanakh, and the movement has been in the past couple centuries to really try and focus and understand what each individual word means, each individual shoresh of each word means, as opposed to saying that there's a bunch of synonyms. Really, every word has a different connotation. So, for example, the king of this theory would be the Malbim, Meir Leibish Malbim. Okay, he was a 19th century Tanakh commentary, and he was famous for, one of the things he was famous for is introducing a new and separate meaning for each shoresh, for each root word, and opening up the text to a whole new interpretation. So in fact, every word has its own meaning, and there's no two Hebrew words that have the exact same meaning. A great example of this would be melech, like in the first verse of the first verse over here, we have this word melech, king, and there's another word moshel, which means a ruler. So what's the difference between a king and a ruler? Especially if you live in a time of kingdoms, there really was. You would think that there would be no difference. In reality, there is a difference. A king is made king by his people, as opposed to a moshel, a ruler, enforces his rule by brute force. And so that's an example of where the this theory of Tanakh commentary or Tanakh understanding will differ from other forms of reading Tanakh. So again, what we're going to try to do is kind of try to understand the roots of the words and why they're being used as opposed to other ones. And we brought up at the very end of the class last week, we didn't go into it, but we brought up the second verse over here, Havel Havelem Amar Koheles, Havel Havelem Hakol Havel. Okay, and that is typically translated, people will usually translate that as the futility of futilities, says Koheles, futility of futilities, everything is futile. Okay, that is your typical translation that you'll find. And we mentioned last week that the term hevel does not literally mean futility. Okay, that was exactly what King Solomon was trying to express with this statement, he would have used a different root. Okay, where we would go, where my mind goes, is he would probably have said Ephes Afasim Amar Koheles. So in Hebrew, Ephes means zero, nothingness, blank. Okay, so you would think he would say Ephes Afasim Amar Koheles, Ephes Afasim Hakol Ephes. All right, but he doesn't do that. Instead, he says Havel Havelim. Okay, which again, we introduced last week that the term I'm sorry if there's a tapping noise. I don't have anything tapping nearby me. It could be, I'm not sure. Okay. Yeah, I'll have to look into that and see what that is. I'm sorry if that's going on. Um, so again, we mentioned last week that the term, I'm sorry for sidetracking over there. We mentioned last week that the term havel literally means steam. Okay, havel havalim markalis, which if you would read it, if you would translate it literally, would mean steam of steams, says Kohelet, steam of steams, all is steam. Again, steam as in similar to smoke, the vapor of water. And we mentioned that that's a very different connotation than nothingness. Steam is a something as opposed to a nothing. So in that case, it would seem that to be that King Solomon is introducing us to a different idea over here. He's not saying that everything is nothing. He's saying that everything is something, but that something is like steam. Okay. I would love to have some audience participation. If anyone would like to share maybe a thought, you could share in the chat. Also, I have the chat open now. If anyone would want to share either on mic yourself or share in the chat, does anyone have any ideas of why that would be that he refers to this situation of life as steam?
It almost has substance. Almost have substance, but it doesn't really have substance.
Okay, that's a great.
Or actually, it comes from substance.
Yeah, right. It's insubstantial. You can't really put your hands on it. You can't. It feels like it's weightless. It has no mass. It has no form. It's almost like tohu vavohu.
Right.
Also, it sort of just dissipates. It's there and it just kind of dissipates and goes away like it was never there, that type of thing.
Right. Okay, so we have, thank you all for sharing. And also we have one in the chat. Ian is adding that you could try catching steam in your hands, and similar to what Mr. Steiber is saying, that also that it dissipates, it's liquid in a gaseous state, meaning that it expands to fill its space, which when it doesn't have a confined space is just going to dissipate into everything. And we have these are all similar ideas. And the idea is that, as Steve and Jacob pointed out, there's something there. It's not a nothing. It is something. It is. It even Jacob mentioned that has no mass. I would argue that actually does have mass. It's not something that we can necessarily pick up on as humans, but obviously scientifically we can measure the power of steam. As it's a lot of the kosher organizations, they kind of struggle with this. Can you kosherize something? Can you kosher something with steam? That's a big disagreement amongst kosher sources. I would just like to remind everybody.
What's your opinion, Rabbi? Can you use steam to kosher a kitchen?
I will leave that to Oregon Kosher to decide. I would direct those questions to Oregon Kosher. If you are not sharing, just make sure that your mic is off so that we're not hearing what else is going on in your background. Just a reminder. So again, the idea is, I think, partially that there is something there that we are dealing with. It's not nothing. It's something very real, but it's something that's hard to grasp onto. I had a different thought, which is similar, but it kind of goes in the direction that the Steibers and Ian were going, which is that, as you said, steam dissipates, and this has really hit me recently as we're nearing. I don't know. I want to say we're nearing the end of COVID, right? Who knows if that's true or not? But we're nearing the evolution of COVID into the next era. As we all have seen, it's radically changed our own lives. It's radically changed, let's take the example of work, the future of work. My mother gets the Wall Street Journal, and they have a feature called the Future of Everything. And one of their things that they're constantly focusing on is, what is blank going to look like after COVID? What is exercise going to look like after COVID? What is work going to look like? So COVID has radically changed everything. And I'm a lot younger than a lot of people on this class, but I remember another experience where life changed drastically and never went back to being the same. Right? I was at the time I was, what was it, 9 years old when 9/11 happened. Right? And that's a watershed moment in human history that no one's going to forget. No one who was around is going to forget what that was like. We went from being able to escort your loved ones to the gate of the airport to not being able to go past security. Yeah, there's everything is constant. Everything changed so drastically and so suddenly with 9/11. But what's interesting is we look back now, and we're now 20 years past 9/11, and we've learned how to live in this new reality, in a new reality where this is a possibility, or in a new reality where security is tighter. And obviously that hasn't been easy. And if you asked us in 2003 what our thoughts were, we would have a much different experience than what we're having right now. But right now we're living at a time when it's really a thing in the past. It changed everything for us, but it's a thing in the past. I mean, if you asked people from 1950, will people forget about World War II? Will anyone ever forget Pearl Harbor? And if they would say, no way, right? But this year was, what was it, 70? This year was not, whatever it was, the anniversary of Pearl Harbor. And there was barely a peep about it, honestly. So things happen and they pass. And I think that's part of what Havel Amar Kohelet is coming to tell us, is that, yes, it can be a sense of everything's futile, but could also be a sense of the things that are bothering me, the things that are weighing me down, those things may pass also. I would point everyone to also Robert's comment in the chat, which is very interesting. So I think that's part of what Kohelet is trying to tell us over here. King Solomon is trying to tell us over here, is that besides for life being fleeting or life being hard to grasp, I would say also it's fleeting in a good way. It's fleeting in the fact that those, thankfully, were able to move past terrible events and move into a brighter future. I think that's part of what King Solomon's telling us. For every, there's two sides of each coin, right? So the ability to forget the past, to move past it, can be a good thing. It can be a bad thing. I think it's good for us to focus on it being potentially a good thing. The Ways of the Righteous, the book Ways of the Righteous, Orchos Tzadikim, he points this out, that if it wasn't for the gift of forgetfulness, women would never have children twice, right? They'd have children once and never have a second child. Similarly, there would be so many things that we wouldn't do. I mean, we have an even better understanding now that we kind of get how trauma works. We can see that there's people who they experience something and they're never able to move past it, and that's an unfortunate experience. So the fact that we're able to move past something, that itself is, I think, an empowering thing. So here we have, again, probably the most depressing, the most potentially depressing verse in Kohelet, the opening lines, that everything is futile, and in reality, it may be telling us a multi-sided lesson that there's something to gain from that. Life passes and it moves on. Does anyone have any questions before we move on to the next verse? Again, feel free to type in the chat anytime, or unmic yourself, or mic yourself. I mean, I'll give another 15 seconds to see if anybody pops in. Okay, so we are going to move on to the third verse here, and this is also again, for sure, the opening lines of Kohelet they end up being the most depressing because he's setting a stage. So here we have another seemingly depressing, and in fact, it could be taken very depressing sentence over here. Ma yisron la'adam, what is the gain for a person? B'chol emalo, with all of his hard work, sheya'amol, that he works hard, that he toils, tachas hashamesh, under the sun. Okay, again, what is the gain to a person with all of his hard work that he does under the sun? Let me see if I can enlarge this text. That's a good point. Font size. I already have it. Oh, there we go. Got a little bigger. Okay, and if anyone doesn't know, this is a great tool, a free tool that's available online. This is called Sefaria, sefaria.org. That's over here in the dialog box over here. Sefaria.org, and it's a great website for using for many Jewish texts, including Tanakh, and in fact all of the Gemara, all of Halacha, basically anything you need. You'll find on Sefaria. It's great and it's absolutely free. So again, we're going to read this verse one more time. What is the gain for a person? With all of his toil, with all of his hard work, that he works hard under the sun. And I would just like to point out over here that I am using the masculine because that's the simple translation of the words. Although in Hebrew, when we are talking for a general audience, the rule is to use masculine. Okay, so it's not specifically for men, so it's not. We could translate it as they. So what is the good? What is the gain for a person? And all of their toil, that they toil under the sun. Okay, so again, the commentaries point out a number of items over here. Number one is you have in the text of Kohelet, there is a Aramaic translation. In the same way that Onkelos was the translator for the Torah, there's a translation of the rest of Tanakh from a different person, a man by the name of Yonasan ben Uziel, who was also a great rabbi of around the same generation. And what he does in Kohelet is he actually gives a whole kind of background. And he says, what was it that King Solomon made this statement? Why was he, what was it that surprised him so much that he pointed this statement out? And he says that King Solomon saw that how much hard work was put into his father David becoming king. He saw all the steps that led up to it, the kingdom of Saul before him, and Saul passing on his kingdom to his son Ishbosheth, and the prophet Samuel trying to find the right king and eventually coming to David, and David struggling to maintain his kingship over the Jewish people. And finally, after 40 years, King David is king over the whole Jewish people, but his entire kingship is a big struggle. He's constantly struggling to maintain control of the Jewish people, whether it's from uprisings, whether it's from plagues, whether it's from claims of scandal against him from the story of Bathsheba. So you have King David, who worked very hard, and there was a lot of lead up to get to his kingship. And King Solomon foresees through prophecy that his son, Rehoboam, is going to end up having the kingdom split from him. He's only going to end up being king over two tribes, over the tribe of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin. And the other 10 tribes are going to be controlled by a different king, Jeroboam, who ends up being one of the most wicked kings of all of history. So we have all this lead up to establish a kingdom of Israel. We have all this lead up to get to King Solomon as being king over the Jewish people. And he sees that it's only going to last one generation, and then it's going to be split again. So with all that, he looks at it and he says, first of all, everything is hevel, everything is fleeting. And second of all, he says, what gain is there for a person with all the work that they put in under the sun? Now we mentioned last week also that the rabbis of later generations felt compelled to hide the book of Kohelet. they felt compelled to hide the book of Ecclesiastes in order, because there are verses in it that seem to contradict each other, and we didn't want to confuse anybody. But they decided to keep the book as part of the canon of Tanakh because of a number of verses that prove to us that it was written with wisdom. Okay, and this is one of them. So it says it begins with wisdom and ends with wisdom. And this is the verse that they're talking about. They say it begins with wisdom. It begins with the words of Torah. Okay, they understand in this verse that what is the gain for a person with all of his work, with all their work that they work under the sun. They see this is words of Torah. And the rabbis point out that the clincher on this verse are these two words over here, tachas hashamesh, under the sun. And they say that under the sun means everything that is under the domain of the physical world. The sun was one of the first things in creation, which is debatable. It wasn't the first thing in creation, even though light was the first thing in creation, but the sun itself didn't show up until the fourth day. But under the sun is a reference to the general creation. And so it says there's no gain for a person with all the work that they put in under the sun. But the rabbis point out that any work you put in over the sun, there is a gain towards. You would gain by doing that. And so that, of course, as the rabbis are wont to do, is referring to the Torah. All right. So any work that a person puts in to words of Torah, that does bear fruit, not only in this world but also in the next world. It's obvious, since one of the things that always differentiates the Jewish people and really modern religion in general from ancient religions, right? So when they go and they excavate or they go through the pyramids and they see all this gold and riches and everything that they tried to bring with them into the next world, and they're just hoping, King Tut was hoping that all this gold would come with him into the next world. In reality, we know it doesn't, right? There's nothing that comes with you into the next world except for words of Torah. There's a fascinating thing that I saw. There's a very well-known book, very complex, but very well-known book on the nature of tefillah, on the nature of prayer and the words of prayer, written in the 18th century by a man by the name of Alexander Ziskind. The name of the book is Yesod v'Shorosh HaAvoda, meaning the foundation and the root of the service. It's basically just a humongous text of Kabbalah, and it's a Kabbalistic take on the prayers. But what he has at the very end of it is they printed with it his living will that he passed on to his children, and he explains there what he wanted done with his own body after he passed. And he has a whole thing which does not follow our modern customs for burial. He wanted them to wash him a certain way, and he wanted them to walk around his body a few times, reciting certain verses. Very strange from our modern perspective. But one of the things that he mentions there is he actually wanted his book to be placed under his head in his coffin. Very strange for a Jewish practice. Again, that's not something we typically do because we don't look at it the same way. Generally, we don't look at it that you bring physical items with you into the world to come. Now, obviously, I don't think that was what he was trying to do. He was trying to, latch on to the merit of his book, not necessarily the book itself, but he's trying to bring that to the world to come. Another fascinating custom that we do have is that if somebody is, God forbid, murdered, they are actually buried in the clothing that they were murdered in, as opposed to they're not changed. Usually we change the body into tachrichim, into burial shrouds made out of linen or muslin or other natural fibers. But if somebody is murdered, because that stands as some sort of merit for him, they suffered in this world before going into the next world, that stands for them. So there is something that you take with you into the next world. There is some gain with that you can gain in this world. And again, that's what the rabbis point out over here, that there is some gain that you get for work that's done above the sun, meaning beyond creation. Okay. there's this one last point I want to point out on the last verse that I forgot to mention, if that's okay. I'm sorry for going back and forth over here, but really these two verses are linked together, because on the subject of creation, the rabbis also point out over here that in the last verse, Havel again means steam, or we could call it futility if that's easier, and then Havelim is a plural, so that's one Hevel plus two Hevels plus one Hevel is over here, plus another two Hevels, adds up altogether to seven Hevels, seven futilities. And the rabbis point out over there that that's corresponding to the 7 days of creation. Again, in the creation, we end up with futility. We end up with something that we can't grasp onto. We end up with we end up with something that is so close to real, but you can't actually catch. But when you look beyond this world, that's when you start to see things that are actually purposeful. Yeah. In a similar vein, there is one of my favorite books. There's a book called Sefer HaIkarim. I'm sorry about that. A little tongue twister. The book of the essentials. Okay, this was a book written by a Rabbi Joseph Albo in the 15th century. He was a very famous, at the time, Spanish philosopher, Jewish philosopher. He was actually involved in some of the debates that we unfortunately were forced into with the Catholic Church at the time. This is in the time leading towards the expulsion of the Jewish people from Spain. And he actually codifies a lot of his debates and his points in his book, Sefer HaIkarim. And he points out over there that the Torah plays a very unique role in our lives. You can technically have a society without Torah. It exists. In fact, America is the greatest example of that. It's a society, it's one of the first of its kind, actually, modern societies, that is built on take God and religion out of the picture. Okay, what do people want? How do the people want their government to be established? This was definitely in the 1700s was a revolutionary idea to create an entire country based on that. So you can have a government, you can have a lifestyle built on there being no God presence, and it will work. It will absolutely work, right? We've seen that again. The American experiment has been going on for nearly 250 years now, so it's definitely works to a certain degree. But what you're never going to get from that experience, is you're never going to get anything beyond this world. You're never going to ensure a place in the world to come. So, taking for granted that we believe in a world to come, following civics, following the rules of civilization: don't kill, don't steal, don't commit adultery. Beyond that, pay your taxes, build roads, care for the poor might be something else. But set up a society where people can function and live. All those things will never do anything for you beyond this world. They will give you a great life in this world, but they'll never give you anything beyond this world into the next world. And he says, for that, you need godly interference. You need some sort of manual to tell you how to move, how to gain something in the next world. And so that's, again, where Torah pops in and moves a step further than society, than civilization. It's great life plus great beyond life. Okay, so again, that's this idea that we're seeing over here in verse 3, that there is a gain for a person with their work that they toil beyond the sun, beyond creation. Okay, I'm going to give it 10 seconds or so if anybody would like to chime in before we move on to the next verse. Okay, we're going to move on to verse 4. I hope we're going at a good pace for everyone. If we're not, please let me know after the class. Just send me an email. In fact, I will include before the end of the class. I'm going to put in the chat my email in case you have any comments. or would like to share anything about how the class is doing, I would love to hear feedback. All right, so we're going to move on to verse number 4 over here. And again, there's chapter 1, verse 4. Dor holech v'dor ba. A generation goes and a generation comes. V'ha'aretz la'olam ha'mades. But the land will last forever. Okay, olam, which typically means world, here it means forever. Okay, so again, the land will stand forever. Again, Hebrew syntax is a little different than English syntax. So again, I'm going to read the verse all as one. Dor holech, a generation goes. V'dor ba, and a generation comes. The haaretz, but the land, la'olam omades, stands forever. Okay. So in this verse, King Solomon is introducing us to another idea. It's very similar to our past ideas, that things come and things go. But now he's specifically talking about generations. Generations go and generations come, which is different than how we would say it in English. Right? In English, we would typically think to say generations come and generations go. I guess in Hebrew, you would say it the other way. It's go and come. So again, generations go and generations come, but the land stays forever. And I think that part of what Kohelet is trying to introduce to us over here is the fact of human nature, and the fact that humans, to a major degree, never really change. This is something that I've noticed, or that I've read about plenty of times. But there's the generations may come and generations may go, but the things that center them and make them the way they are basically stays the same. The desire for freedom, the desire for pleasure, the desire for control and power. These are things that are basically universal, and they are beyond one period of time. People have always desired to have autonomy over themselves, right? They have always desired to live a peaceful life, to live in times of peace. And that guides those things, that aretz, that piece of land stays forever. The Malbim, which, as I mentioned, Malbim before, he was that 19th century commentator on Tanakh. He actually does not have a commentary on Kohelet. It's one of the blank spots in the Malbim file. But he does, in other places, he points out that aretz, the term land, typically refers to a civilization, not just a land, but civilization stands forever. Now, obviously, civilizations do not stand forever, right? And many of the greatest civilizations in the history of the world have fallen apart. And, you know, we can only assume that everyone will eventually. However, the fact of civilization, the fact of there being these truths about human nature that are impossible to avoid, those things last forever, and that comes and goes in every single generation. Okay, so the same desire for recognition that people had is the same desire for recognition that people will always have. In a similar way, I read a very interesting book about 2 years ago by a musicologist by the name of Nolan Gasser. He goes on a kind of a little a thought experiment. He says, take, for example, Star Wars. Now, I'm a big Star Wars fan. I don't know if anybody else is, but I know everyone else is, but I hope everyone else is. Anyway, Star Wars, I love Star Wars. But in the the original Star Wars movie, I won't say the first, in the original Star Wars movie, there's the scene, the cantina scene, famously, where Luke Skywalker, Obi-Wan Kenobi, they go into a bar, a cantina, and they try to find a pilot to take them to the planet of Alderaan. Okay, so in this bar, there's musicians playing music. It's the only music of the Star Wars movie that wasn't done by John Williams, the great composer John Williams. So it's bar music, and so this author, this musicologist Nolan Gasser, he wonders, kind of goes for this thought experiment. He says, if you were to actually go to some other galaxy and step into a bar, a cantina, and listen to the music, how different would it sound from our music? And he says, well, certain things are still going to be true. You're still going to only have 7 chords. 7 notes. I'm sorry. So with only 7 notes, and in order for music to sound good, has to follow certain rhythms, certain patterns, certain systems. So those things are going to still be true, likely still going to be true no matter where you go. So his theory is, again, this is only a theory, but his theory is that if you were to walk into a cantina, it would actually probably sound kind of similar to what you would expect in any bar cantina. It would be lively, kind of, dance, something to dance to, something to drink to, etc. Right? So that's that. And the point is that humans, that people, thinking people, we have similar tendencies no matter where we go, no matter where we come from. Obviously, there's certain societal differences. I always notice this when you talk about countries that have lived under communism, countries that have lived under capitalism, which are obviously, there's a lot more nuance than that. But in communist countries or collectivist societies, in many ways, the individual loses a lot of his importance. So there are some differences that are going to be vast, great differences between one society and the next. But certain things are innate and they won't break from human to human. So again, over here, I think this is part of what King Solomon's trying to introduce to us, is that Dor Holech, a generation goes, V'dor ba, another generation will come. And it may look different, but also may look very similar. Because Haaretz, the society, La'olam Hamedes, it stands with it forever. It stands in its same general mold forever. So again, King Solomon's now jumping to something else over here. Whereas in the last 2 verses, he's telling us that your work in this world, if it's just for this world, is going to be limited in its scope of effectiveness. However, if you work beyond this world, if you work for something greater than this world, it's actually you're going to go much farther with it. Here he introduces a related concept, but again, something slightly different, and where he's saying that look at the world around you, you're going to see certain things that are always true. And it doesn't matter what generation you live in, you're going to be seeing similar ideas and similar concepts and similar reactions to things. And that's going to, those are things that are natural to the human being and are not going to jump, are not going to change from generation to generation. Okay. So again, Dor Holech, a generation goes. With Dor Ba, another generation will come. It will fill the void of the last generation. But again, society, Olam Omades, will last forever. Okay. I don't want to jump into the next verse yet. We'll save that for next week. Last week I left you with a cliffhanger. But you know what? I'm going to leave you with a question that hopefully we'll get to again next week, which is we're going to see throughout the book of Kohelet that he will consistently refer to certain things as Hevel. He will refer to a bunch of things as Hevel, as again, we're calling that futility or steam, or again, it's a nuance. It's a very nuanced term. It means something that you can try to grasp but can't quite get. It expands, it dissipates, it's physical, but it's hard to hold on to. He's going to continue to call things, he says this and this and this and this, that's Hevel. And this and this and that, that's Hevel. Right, here's an example right here in verse 14 that we're going to get to in a couple of weeks. I have seen all the actions, that all the creations that are created under the sun. All of it is Hevel, Ru'us Ruach, and we're going to have to translate what Ru'us Ruach means when we get there, because it's also a little complex. But so again, here's another case where he is referring to something as Hevel. He's going to refer to here. I have said in my heart, let me go and pour the libations of happiness and see all the good. And that, behold, it is also Hevel. Okay, so he's going to go and call a bunch of things Hevel. So I would like to maybe if anyone wants to consider over this week, what do you think when we're going to use Hevel as a description of a specific aspect of life? Why is that? Why does he keep on coming back to that term? Okay. Again, we won't go on to that for this week. I'm just going to put into the chat right now my email in case anybody wants to reach out to me directly, in case you don't have my email. Okay, that's in the chat right there. That's rao@portlandkohelet.org. If you have any comments or concerns, or just we would like to correct me on something, please feel free to reach out to me at that email. Again, that's in the chat. You can also contact the Kohelet at any time through our info email address or on our website. We have a chat feature on the website if you want, so you could reach out to us there. Rabbi Diskin, I believe, gets those directly sent to him. So if you ever have a question, feel free to reach out to me or anybody else at the Kollel. That's it for today. Thank you for joining us, and I hope to see you back here next week.